Good evening. We apologize for the technical difficulties we had in our attempt to live stream. We believe the tech for live stream was disrupted by the storm. We appreciate your patience and apologize for any inconvenience this has caused. Welcome to our presentation on COVID-19, Catholic Social Teaching and the Path Forward with Dr. John Snagaki. I'm Kathy Cole, the Coordinator of Marriage Ministry for Bellarmine Chapel. We're happy to be co-sponsoring this presentation with the Xavier University Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice. A brief note before we start. The Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice is offering 3 fall classes that our audience might be interested in signing up for. 2 of these will be fully online. Recovery and Healing After Trauma with Dr. Thuring, who led our May live stream, and Buddhist Christian Comparative Studies with Dr. Herr. And 1 in-person course on Ignatian Spirituality with Dr. Clark, who led our June live stream. Sign-up details can be found on the ISSJ website. Now to introduce Dr. John Snagaki. Dr. Snagaki is an associate professor of religious ethics and has taught at Xavier University since 2001. He's the author of Catholic Social Teaching and Economic Globalization, The Quest for Alternatives, as well as various journal articles and book chapters. John also serves as director of Xavier University's Peace and Justice Studies minor and is active in the parish's Healthy Earth team. So let us welcome Dr. Snagaki. Thank you, John, for being with us here tonight.
Thank you for having me. And I will add my apologies to those who tried to join us live, but if you're watching this, obviously you found a way to it after all, so we're very glad that you're joining us in this manner. So my plan for this evening is just to talk a little bit about Catholic social teaching in general, because I realize people will be coming to this with a variety of backgrounds, and then to talk about what are some of the implications of Catholic social teaching for thinking about the coronavirus crisis. And so I am going to go back and screen share a PowerPoint here. And so when people speak about Catholic social teaching, usually people have in mind a tradition that's dated as beginning in 1891 with a document from Pope Leo XIII entitled Rerum Novarum. Pope Leo was responding to some of the issues arising out of the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the exploitation of workers. And so in this document, he has some fairly strong things to say. And so there's a quote on the screen there. "It has come to pass that working men have been given over, isolated and defenseless, to the callousness of employers and the greed of unrestrained competition. A small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the masses of the poor a yoke little better than slavery itself." So a fairly sharp critique. And so this was really placing the Catholic Church on the side of workers in the context of some of the social struggles that were going on in that time period. And so Pope Leo called for things like a just wage, and he was quick to point out that a just wage was not necessarily the same as a market wage, right? Because people might be forced to accept a lower than just wage if they have no other alternative. But he argued if the employer could pay more, that the employer was actually engaging, therefore, in a form of violence against their workers if they didn't. He also called for an end to child labor, limits on working hours, improved working conditions in terms of health and safety, and affirmed the right of workers to form workers' associations or unions. And so this theme of economic justice becomes really one of the dominant themes of the whole tradition of Catholic social teaching. It's reaffirmed by every subsequent pope. And for many years, that's the main theme that Catholic social teaching talks about, is these concerns for economic justice and the rights of workers. But later, other themes get added in as prominent themes as well. So especially after World War II, and then especially even more so from the 1960s on, the theme of war and peace becomes much more prominent. So in 1963, Pope John the 23rd issues a document called Pacem in Terris, or Peace on Earth, and has this very provocative statement. He says, "It is contrary to reason to hold that war is now a suitable way to restore rights which have been violated." This is followed up a couple years later by the Second Vatican Council, calling on Catholics to evaluate war with, quote, "an entirely new attitude." This kind of deeper critical look at war continues in the subsequent popes, and there's a lot of very strong statements against war made by Pope Paul the Sixth, John Paul II, Pope Benedict, as well as Pope Francis. This is a quote on the screen here from Pope Benedict when he was asked about Pope John Paul II's critique of the war in Iraq. He says, "There were not sufficient reasons to unleash a war against Iraq, to say nothing of the fact that given the new weapons that go beyond the combatant groups, today we should be asking ourselves if it is still licit to admit the very existence of a just war." So this kind of deep critique of war becomes a central part of the tradition, certainly affirmed as well by Pope Francis. Francis says, "War is never a satisfactory means of redressing injustice and achieving balanced solutions to political and social discord. All war is ultimately, as Pope Benedict XV stated in 1917, that is in the context of World War I, a senseless slaughter. War is never a necessity, nor is it inevitable." And Francis goes on in a more recent document to really call Catholics to embrace nonviolence. And he says, "Jesus marked out the path of nonviolence. To be true followers of Jesus today includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence." And this critique of war also includes a critique of high levels of military spending, and this will be relevant later as we talk about some of the things needed in response to the coronavirus crisis and the question of where can money come to pay for them, right? So the Vatican has affirmed that high levels of military spending are, quote, "a crime, for even when they are not used, by their cost alone, armaments kill the poor." Other themes that get added into the tradition as well, especially beginning with the 1960s, concerns for global poverty and hunger and integral development with Paul VI. He's really the first pope to travel broadly around the world, make trips to Africa, Latin America, deeply, deeply impacted by the poverty that he saw, and really felt that needed to become a central concern of the church. Issues of ecology become important concerns from the 1970s on. And sort of connected with that, but sort of pushing it a little further, Pope Francis in the Laudato Si begins to talk about the inherent value of all creatures. So no longer just talking about humans as being created as, you know, the main creature that God intended and everything else sort of there to serve humans, but a much more kind of holistic affirmation of the worth of all creatures. You know, one could argue that the full implications of that haven't been, you know, thought through and developed yet within the tradition, but it sort of opened up that as a new theme within Catholic social teaching. Some of the central principles of the tradition that'll be relevant to our conversation about coronavirus: fundamental affirmation of human dignity. The inherent worth of all people is created in the image of God. This grounds a very broad and holistic conception of human rights that I'll talk more about in a second. This is all understood within the context of the centrality of community and the common good. So the understanding of rights that gets developed in Catholic social teaching is not a highly individualistic understanding, sort of, I can do whatever I want, and, you know, in the context of coronavirus, sort of, I don't have to wear a mask, you know, Catholic social teaching would say that's a misuse of the language of rights, because rights are always in this broader context of solidarity, concern for the common good, and community. And so the notion of rights that gets developed is a broad, holistic one. It's an affirmation of both civil political rights, which is, you know, we think of from the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution, right to freedom of speech, assembly, freedom of the press. But very significantly, Catholic social teaching also includes an affirmation of economic and social rights. So the right to food, the right to healthcare, the right to education, the right to housing, as fundamental rights of the human person. So a fourth point of these fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching, following up from related to the others, is an affirmation of both political democracy and economic democracy. And I think everyone pretty much understands what political democracy is all about, so that, you know, trying to prevent the concentration of political power. If you're not as familiar with the term economic democracy, if you think about it sort of the same way, you can probably get a sense of what it means. It's measures to prevent the concentration of economic power. So economic democracy generally involves a more equitable, broader dispersion of wealth. It involves increased worker and community participation in economic decision-making. So in a pure form, this might include things like worker-owned co-ops, where workers are choosing the managers and sharing in the profits, things like that. But it can also just include things, sort of a lesser extent of things like workers having a say on the board of directors of companies, as is the case in many European countries. And then economic democracy also includes strong regulations to protect workers, the environment, and consumers. So again, an important role for the state in protecting people from the injustices that might be present in an economic system. And so this language of economic democracy, not used abundantly in Catholic social teaching, but has been used by a number of popes to describe the kind of alternative that they're pointing to. And so we'll talk more about that, especially as we talk about the coronavirus crisis, its impacts, and some of the suggested responses. These principles are rooted in a very fundamental theological claim that the goods of the earth are intended for all. And so this comes very clearly from Scripture, which says everything belongs to God, and it's God's intent that these goods be shared so everyone's basic needs are met. We see that in Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, for example, in the Sabbath year and Jubilee year provisions that call for periodic forgiveness of debts, periodic release of servants or slaves, things like that, and a periodic redistribution of land. So measures to prevent economic inequality from becoming embedded in the structures of society. And this theme continues through Catholic tradition. So quote there from Pope John Paul II, it's the task of nations, their leaders, their economic powers, and all people of goodwill to seek every opportunity for more equitable sharing of resources. Pope Francis reiterates these same themes. He says the earth is essentially a shared inheritance whose fruits are meant to benefit everyone. For believers, this becomes a question of fidelity to the Creator, since God created the world for everyone. The Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable. And so following from these principles, Catholic social teaching really articulates a sharp critique of both Soviet-style communism as well as existing forms of capitalism. And I think especially with John Paul II, people understood his deep critique of communism coming out of his experiences in Poland. But people were often surprised to learn, because it wasn't as talked about as much, at least in the United States, as his deep critique of capitalism. And we see this in the quote there. The Church, since Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, has always distanced herself from capitalist ideology, holding it responsible for grave social injustices. I myself, after the historical failure of communism, did not hesitate to raise serious doubts on the validity of capitalism. And again, the question of, well, what are they pointing to if they don't like communism, they don't like existing forms of capitalism? It's again that vision of greater economic democracy. Another kind of theological theme that undergirds this is the notion of a preferential option for the poor. We see this in Scripture, God in Exodus siding with the oppressed slaves, the prophets continually critiquing the leaders of society for their oppression of the poor. Jesus in his first sermon in the Gospel of Luke, saying that he was sent to proclaim good news to the poor and liberation to the oppressed and freedom to for the prisoner. So this notion of an option for the poor deeply rooted throughout the entirety of Scripture, and affirmed here by Francis. Every individual Christian in every community is called to be an instrument of God for the liberation and promotion of the poor. And again, this will come up, of course, in the context of the coronavirus crisis, because it has been the poor who have been most impacted by the crisis, as we'll see. Ecological concern, we've talked a bit about, but certainly another central theme of Catholic social teaching. And important to say, this has been talked about now for a long time. So John Paul II in 1990 issued a document calling on Catholics to have a deep concern for ecology, and saying at that time that climate change was one of the world's most pressing issues. So it's something the Catholic Church has been talking about for over 30 years. In this document that he issued in 1990, he says, today the ecological crisis has assumed such proportions as to be the responsibility of everyone. Christians in particular realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty towards nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith. And Francis tells us in Laudato Si that we need to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. All of these principles give rise to a call for a wide variety of reforms to bring about greater economic democracy, for example. So calls for third world debt relief, calls for a more just system of international trade, calls to decrease military spending and shift that to social spending, measures to lessen economic inequality, such as redistribution of land, preferential support for small and medium-sized businesses, more progressive taxation, so taxing the wealthy at higher rates. All of these are called for in various Catholic social teaching documents. And then all these themes of Catholic social teaching get embedded in an even broader framework of a consistent ethic of life. And so here concerns about abortion, euthanasia, the death penalty, for example, are brought in as well into this kind of deeper fabric of interconnected concerns for life. And then lastly, how are these very fundamental reforms that Catholic social teaching calls for to be brought about? There's a lot of emphasis on a notion of solidarity. So solidarity is talked about in the tradition as a virtue, but it's important to say that something more than empathy or compassion, or at least the way that that's often understood, but it also involves a commitment to take action as a result, right? So it's compassion, but it's compassion that leads to action is what is meant by solidarity. Also a strong emphasis that these major reforms that are needed should be brought about through nonviolent struggle and nonviolent means rather than violent means. And a strong emphasis on a contemplative dimension that, to really commit to bringing about these kinds of changes in the world involves a deep groundedness in relationship with God. So practices of prayer, meditation, contemplation is certainly seen as what really undergirds the ability to live out Catholic social teaching. So bringing this a bit more directly into the context of the coronavirus crisis, here are some of the things Pope Francis has had to say. He expresses a strong hope that this crisis will serve as a wake-up call to humanity. He says the crisis is calling us to live differently. And in particular, he talks about it as wanting the crisis to challenge our sense of apathy, our people's sense of greed, and especially to challenge what he often terms the globalization of indifference, right? And a very powerful quote from one of his talks on the coronavirus, he says, quote, "Greedy for profit, we let ourselves get caught up in things and lured away by haste. We were not shaken awake by wars or injustice across the world, nor did we listen to the cry of the poor or of our ailing planet. We carried on regardless, thinking we could stay healthy in a world that was sick." And what Francis is praying, and this is actually, that quote was actually from in the context of our prayer to God. He's really praying that the crisis will lead us to address these deeper sicknesses of our world, sicknesses of economic inequality, of racism, of violence, of ecological devastation, and praying that it will give rise to what he terms new forms of hospitality, fraternity, and solidarity. Very strikingly, Francis uses the term viral genocide. He warns that if policymakers put the well-being of the economy above the well-being of people's lives, this could result in a viral genocide. And so it's a very strong sense of priorities that you can't go with sort of open the economy at any cost, right? That would be a fundamental violation of people's human dignity that we saw as a core principle of the Catholic social teaching tradition. And then lastly, he highlights the crucial role of grassroots social movements and pushing for some of these deeper structural changes that he thinks are so much needed. And we'll come back to that later, but that's really been an important contribution of Francis to Catholic social teaching, to say these changes aren't necessarily going to happen from the top down. It's going to take a broad and deep social movement and social struggle to bring them about. So as we talk about the coronavirus crisis itself, helpful to just spend a few words about some issues related to the origins of the crisis. And so many analysts argue that it has its origins in an exploitative human relationship with nature and with animals. So the vast majority of infectious diseases, especially viruses in recent years, have come out of contexts where wildlife was being taken and exploited for food, or from contexts of factory farms where animals were being brought together in this way. So here's a quote from Jane Goodall as she's talking about the pandemic. She says, "It is our disregard for nature and our disrespect of the animals we should share this planet with that has caused this pandemic." And so some key factors that we've seen have been the destruction of nature through climate change, through deforestation, through other ways that humans have impacted upon nature and brought humans more into touch with wildlife, right? And it gives additional vectors for viruses to then make the transition from wildlife to humans. So it's thought with the coronavirus that it probably originated in bats. And then the bats were brought to a wildlife market where wild animals of all different kinds, domestic animals too, were brought together, sold, slaughtered. That people were exposed to the bodily, waste of these animals, and animals exposed to each other. So it was able to, cross the species barrier in that context. And we know numerous other lethal viruses have had similar origins. So the SARS virus in 2003 is also traced back to the so-called wet markets. The 2013 bird flu has understood to have had similar origins. Other viruses have emerged out of factory farm conditions. So the H1N1 virus of 2009 is thought to have originated in pig farms in North Carolina. The H5N1 bird flu traced to a chicken farm in Kansas, etc. And so this call for a more respectful relationship with nature is a lesson that many are trying to learn from the origins of this virus. So this is a quote from Inger Anderson. She is the executive director of the UN Environment Program, and she's talking about the crisis. She said, "Nature is sending us a message. There are too many pressures at the same time on our natural systems, and something has to give. We are intimately connected with nature. If we don't take care of nature, we can't take care of ourselves." And that's certainly a theme that Pope Francis has articulated over and over again as well. So this call for a more mutual, more respectful relationship with nature. And I think it's very appropriate, therefore, that the follow-up conversation that we're going to have to this event is actually going to be a meatless meetup. So sharing a conversation over a vegetarian meal, which normally we would do in person, but in this case will be done via Zoom, but to think about some of those issues. And so we're encouraging people who want to participate in that evening to consider having a vegetarian meal that evening, either during or before our conversation. So just to talk a little bit about the current state of the crisis, I'm sure you've seen a lot of this in the news in recent days, but you may or may not have seen some of these kinds of graphs, which I think really brings these issues to life in a clearer way. But we've been seeing new record highs in the United States just about daily over the past week or 10 days. And even the graphs that I have are going to be outdated already, because a couple days ago we had over 57,000 new cases in the United States. You can see this was made maybe 4 or 5 days ago, and we were just up to 40. So it shot all the way up to 57,000 since then. So you need to add a few more bars to your to the chart here. And so it gives you a sense of, you had this huge surge back in, late March into April. Then things began to sort of level off, slowly go down, and then in June, just this massive increase that we've been experiencing. U.S. cases have risen over 85% in the last 2 weeks or so. The 7-day average has risen over 45 states. So the spread is just about everywhere in the entire country, different degrees in different places, but the increase is very broad. Dr. Anne Shushat, who is Principal Deputy Director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, very sadly has concluded that the United States now has, quote, way too much of the virus to contain it the way that other countries have successfully done. We'll talk about that more in a minute when we see some other charts of how well some other countries have actually done in containing the virus. The United States has absolutely failed to do that. And so the conclusion of Dr. Shushat is this is really the beginning, not the end of the crisis in the United States. This was a comment she made just a couple days ago. Tom Frieden, former director of the CDC, has very similar things to say. He said just 3 days ago on July 3rd, quote, "It's worse. Will continue to get worse and will take months to improve substantially. We are going in the wrong direction fast. We have months of risk, suffering, economic and hardship and restrictions ahead." If we look globally, there's also been some new records set in recent days, although it is important to say that over half of the new cases that are being diagnosed right now are in two countries, the United States and Brazil. But globally, total cases so far are now up to 10.7 million that have been diagnosed. There's undoubtedly significantly more that were not diagnosed. And over 500,000 deaths. So the latest estimates I've seen are about 515,000 deaths. The United States is responsible for about 2.7 million of those cases, about 130,000 deaths. And so basically, if you look at those figures, you can see the United States has about a quarter of the world's cases and a quarter of the world's deaths, despite only having 4% of the world's population. So the US is experiencing the crisis much, much more deeply than most of the rest of the world. The World Health Organization a couple of days ago put out a statement saying the crisis as a whole is accelerating and, quote, the worst is yet to come. So the situation is very, very serious in the United States in particular, especially dire. So this is a chart just showing a few select countries, including the United States and Brazil, which, as I mentioned, are really having the worst issues right now. But also shows some of the other European countries, so Italy and France, which had serious problems, but were able to get it under control, took action, and were able to pretty well level off. Other countries that did better from the start, especially the ones totally at the bottom, South Korea, Norway, New Zealand, for example, have done exceptionally well in dealing with the crisis. So New Zealand, for example, has had only 22 recorded deaths so far. Taiwan has only had 7. South Korea, which experienced its first case, or I forget it was the first case or the first death, the same day as the United States, has been able to limit their deaths to under 300. Some of the Scandinavian countries have done especially well. Also, in terms of larger countries in Europe, Germany has the best record. They've been able to keep their deaths to under around 9,000. So some of the countries have done especially well. Here are some photos of the leaders of those countries. And of course, you may notice a common feature among these leaders, which has been striking to many, which is the fact that female leaders have tended to do a much better job in responding to the crisis and leading their nation through these difficult times. Certainly with exceptions, there's some male leaders who've done exceptionally well also, but the majority of the countries that have really kept the issue under control have been led by women, which is something that many have found a very interesting and striking phenomenon. So just another chart looking at the cases, and you can see how the United States has diverged from Europe, right? So in the early stages, they were, you can see pretty much a similar trajectory. Europe a little bit ahead of the United States in terms of cases and deaths. But then Europe began to get its act together, fairly sharp reduction, and then leveled off. Canada, similar. Japan never had that series of problems to begin with. They were able to get it under control. But you can see the United States as kind of an outlier here, just shooting up. And again, this is from several days ago, so this would be significantly higher now. So a kind of a bifurcation of what was happening in Europe versus what's happening in the United States. You can see that also in this chart. And again, you need to add a bunch more lines to the chart. This is average new cases, 35,000. I mentioned that recently the daily case at least was up at 57,000. So this line continues to go upward at a very sharp trajectory in the United States. And you again here can see Europe having brought it down and keeping it under. So Europe is by and large in a position where they can begin reopening, at least in many places, more safely. The United States did it prematurely and is bearing the consequences of that. So the question arises, well, why then did the United States do so poorly? To be brutally honest, it primarily has to do with President Trump and his administration and the things that have been or haven't been done. So the Trump administration had advance warning of the possibility of a pandemic, and didn't prepare, didn't ramp up testing, stockpile supplies, didn't put in place a system for contact tracing, didn't stockpile masks. A lot of the Asian countries that did especially well did do all these things and were much better prepared to deal with it, even though they had much less time to do so. It took several months for to migrate to the U.S. Other countries that were exposed to it much more quickly were able to deal with it better because they had prepared better. There was ignoring of warnings. President Trump's advisors have said that, especially in late January, early February, they're trying to get his attention on this issue. In their words, the warnings from the intelligence community were blinking red, but they were unable to get President Trump to focus on it or to do anything much about it yet at that point. And those few weeks and months were enormously critical in terms of what could have been done to have prevented the deaths. At later times, from the beginning, the downplaying of the crisis, misleading the public, saying everything's under control, et cetera, when it wasn't. So you had that going on. You had a failure to use the Defense Production Act to guarantee adequate supplies. Again, masks, personal protective equipment of various kinds for healthcare personnel, adequate testing, because the key really in the countries that have done it well is that immediately when there were cases, they did widespread testing, they traced the contacts of those persons, they isolated, and were able to keep it under control. Even when President Trump was forced to admit this, the seriousness of the problem, which had been there for a while, he quickly began to undercut his own experts, sometimes implying that it was a hoax, encouraging false hope or harmful remedies, and then later on encouraging armed protesters even who were challenging needed health measures, and in general discouraging and not modeling mask usage, and then pushing for premature opening of the economy. So all of these kinds of factors coming together. I also forgot to mention that the United States had been offered a large amount of tests from the World Health Organization. The US turned those down and said, we'll create our own tests. When those were created, they were found to have had serious flaws, so that made it even more problems in terms of testing at the early stage. So a lot of ways that the crisis has been mishandled. It's been estimated by a study by epidemiologists Britta and Nicholas Jewell that about 90% of the coronavirus-related deaths in the U.S. could have been prevented with more responsible leadership, and they base that on what other countries were successfully able to do primarily, and various other studies have affirmed that as well. So this is crucial to keep in mind in terms of understanding how we got to the situation where we are in this country. In terms of the impacts of the crisis, as many of you I'm sure are aware, they haven't been borne equally across the population. So there has been unequal distribution of cases by race and ethnicity. And it's the Latino or Latinx community. For those who aren't familiar with the term Latinx, it's often used to include all people, Latinos and Latinas, and just a kind of a more general term that can be used. It doesn't have the gender differentiation to it. So the Latinx community has experienced about 34% of all the cases, known cases in the United States. Over a third of cases have been in the Latinx community, even though they make up only about 18% of the population. The African American and Black community has experienced about 20% of coronavirus cases, while making up only 12% of the population, so significantly beyond the percent of the population that they entail. Some of the highest rates of the virus in the country have also been in Native American communities. And we see this not only in cases, but also, and even more strikingly in some ways, in terms of hospitalizations. And so if you look at the chart here, see the rate for hospitalization for non-Hispanic whites is about 40 cases per 100,000. For Hispanic Latino, it's 4 times as high, 160. For the Black population, it is about 4.5 times as high. out of nearly 180. And the highest rate among Native Americans, about 5.5 times as the rate for whites. So this again is hospitalizations due to the coronavirus. In terms of deaths, we see similar kinds of phenomenon, but here it's especially the African American community that's been most hard hit, and that's the community represented by the third bar down there. The death rate has been more than twice the death rate of whites, and about 1.5 times the death rate of Native Americans. The death rate for the Latinx population is not substantially higher than whites, but this is misleading, and the main reason for it seems to be that the Latinx population is a lot younger. And so there are not as many deaths, but when it's adjusted for age, the deaths within any age bracket are significantly higher than for whites as well. So what are some of the, in terms of African Americans, this is kind of a look at it by various states and the enormity of the disparities. And so in many states, the proportion of deaths that are among African Americans is even as much as 4 times as high as the African American share of the population. So in Missouri, African American population is 11%, but deaths 42%. In Michigan, 14% population, 41% of the deaths, etc. Wisconsin, Kansas, about 4 times the share of the population. In Ohio, a little bit less, but still a disparity. You can see down here further, 12% of the population, 19% of the deaths. So the question arises, why such disparities? Why is the African American community, the Latinx community, Native American communities being so especially hard hit? And it doesn't seem to have anything to do with with the genetics, but has to do with social factors and the various forms of historical racism and discrimination that these various groups have experienced. So some of the factors include a higher percentage of persons in these ethnic and racial groups being in kind of frontline essential jobs, especially service jobs. They're unable to work from home, so more likely to be exposed to the virus. Higher likelihood to not have paid a sick leave, so needing to go to work even when feeling sick, which leads to obviously spread of the virus. Persons from these communities often have higher rate of pre-existing health conditions, often due to higher rates of poverty, discrimination, less access to quality health care, more crowded living conditions, greater likelihood of needing to use public transportation, and exposure to higher levels of pollution. So there have been various studies that have shown higher levels of living in areas with higher levels of air pollution make people more susceptible to the more serious complications with the virus. And so environmental racism is certainly an important factor there of who gets exposed to the pollutants. So in short, why such disparities? The simple answer is multiple forms of systemic racism in our society that need to be challenged in general, but also even more in light of the impacts of this particular crisis. So other particularly vulnerable groups, and I should say with those factors that we just looked at, many of those would also apply to low-income whites as well, right? Because a lot of those were factors related to class and not only race and ethnicity. So that is important to keep in mind. I haven't seen any figures in terms of socioeconomic status of people with the virus, but one can certainly assume that it's primarily among those with lower income. Other groups that have been especially vulnerable, we've certainly seen prisoners. We've seen that right here in Ohio, and in an especially powerful way. So the Marion Correctional Institute, at least as of a few days ago, held the record for the largest concentration of COVID-19 cases of any institution in the United States. Over 2,000 prisoners there had gotten the virus, about 13 had died. Pickaway Correctional Institute, also in Ohio, is the second largest concentration of cases in any institution in the US. 35 persons there have died. So 4 of the 5 top institutions are prisons. The 5th is a meatpacking plant, which we'll talk more about in a second. But in prisons, problems of overcrowding, lack of ability to socially distance, often not being provided with masks, has been some of the factors facilitating that spread. So many groups have been calling for, especially low-level nonviolent offenders, to be released, so that they're not in a context where their life could be in danger. And certainly numerous Catholic leaders have been joining in that call. Other groups, especially vulnerable immigrants in detention facilities, and again, we've seen that in Ohio. The Morrow County Jail north of Columbus, which has been used as an ICE detention facility for immigrants, recently reported that it had 100% COVID infection rate. And so similarly, people have been calling for the release of detainees. That call has been supported, for example, by John Sandweg, former acting director of ICE, who has highlighted the immorality of keeping detainees in conditions where their lives could be put in danger. These are not, in general, people who are any danger to society. They can be safely released and should be. A third group that's been in the news is actually workers in meatpacking plants, and some of the highest concentrations have been there. Again, a variety of things going on there, generally horrific work conditions to begin with, very, very crowded, poor ventilation systems, the colder temperatures. The virus does better in cold than in heat. Most of the workers there are undocumented immigrants, many of them living in very crowded situations, some were easily able to spread the virus amongst themselves. And again, even apart from a COVID context of, in general, horrific conditions, has the highest injury rate, highest turnover rate of any occupation in the United States. And certainly another reason to think about transitioning one's diet away from participation in that. Those in abusive home situations also very vulnerable in the context of this crisis, particularly with stay-at-home orders, including especially children, right? So children who abusive situations would often be detected by their teachers when they're not going to school. Teachers aren't able to detect and report, and so a lot of concern about the dangers of escalating abuse and the inability to respond as effectively to it. So an issue needing a much deeper attention and action. And then, of course, the elderly, certainly the most vulnerable to the virus itself, but also in many ways marginalized by the broader society. And so there have been numerous reports, for example, of people with the virus actually being sent to nursing homes because the hospitals wanted to free up beds for other people who needed maybe more acute care at any given point in time. But the result of that was then spreading these viruses throughout nursing home facilities. Nursing homes also often weren't given the kind of personal protective equipment that was needed. And so, a lot of concerns of is that reflecting sort of a broader marginalization of the elderly in our society, and what can we do to challenge that as well? So a lot of what I've been highlighting have been vulnerable groups in the United States. And there's certainly some overlap of those groups, of course, as we move more internationally. But it is important to say that some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of the crisis are the global poor people who are on the margins, who are experiencing hunger in deep ways, for example. And so some of the impacts of this hasn't always been the direct impact of getting the virus. So far, the virus hasn't spread as widely in poorer countries as was initially feared, though there's certainly exceptions to that. But the economic impact has often been severe, sort of the global economic shutdown. So the World Food Program is serving record numbers of people, providing emergency food aid. They're warning of the danger of famines if governments and others don't respond with adequate funding. And simply they say that the pandemic, quote, is making the poorest poorer and the hungriest hungrier. They highlight the need for increased financial assistance, for third world debt relief. We talked earlier about the Jubilee movement as part of scripture, the call for debt relief. This has been revitalized in the contemporary context by Christians and others to call for to call for debt relief for some of the world's poorer nations. And the coronavirus has certainly highlighted even more the need for that call. Also the need for fair terms of trade, the way that free trade agreements, for example, have deeply devastated small farmers all around the world. So a lot of these issues, some of the deeper kinds of structural issues that Pope Francis has been calling us to look at and address, that were there before the crisis, but that are being even made more clear through the current crisis. And so lastly, questions of what has been done and what could be done to try to respond more effectively in the context of Catholic social teaching. So some of the things that have been done, we're obviously familiar with. In many places have put in place, shelter-in-place orders at various points in time, although in the United States, most of those have been lifted in recent weeks. We've seen some of the halted non-essential businesses. And these have been effective in saving lives. So the lead author of a research study in the journal Nature had this to say: I don't think any human endeavor has ever saved so many lives in such a short period of time, which is quite a striking quote there. That said, some countries use that period of time better than others, as we've seen from the previous charts. The United States, by and large, did not. And so even though all these sacrifices were made, which did save lives, it didn't enable the virus to be gotten as well under control as some other countries have been able to do. And so the medical journal, The Lancet, actually said, that the United States has lacked a cohesive national strategy and had, in their words, volatile, incompetent leadership that they gave as the main reason for this difference in response. Other things that have been done, of course, have been to try to provide economic aid to those who have been most deeply impacted by the crisis. And so we've seen a variety of bills that have been passed in the U.S. Congress to provide aid, though critics argue that in the U.S. context, more aid has often been provided to large corporations and wealthy individuals, including various kinds of tax breaks that were put into these bills that weren't even related to coronavirus, rather than primarily giving money, mainly to persons most in need. So the European countries have often dealt with this very differently. So a lot of their social support has actually been to pay people's wages, pay often 3/4 to 4/5 of wages to keep people from even needing to go on to unemployment, for example. Whereas the US chose to have people become unemployed and then provide some assistance in that manner. But it's important to recognize that those kind of expanded unemployment benefits in the US are about to run out. So they're scheduled to, the extra benefits are scheduled to end at the end of July, which would significantly decrease the amount of aid that people are getting. Many of the other provisions, like temporary moratoriums on evictions and things like that, depending on the location, have either already expired or in most cases are soon to expire. And so there's enormous concern of how many people are likely to become homeless even within the next several weeks to a month if action isn't taken to try to respond more constructively to that. There is various legislation in Congress that could do that, but it is right now being stalled in the Senate. We can maybe come back to that and talk about that a bit more later. So lastly, what are some things that can or should be done from the perspective of Catholic social teachings? So if we're wanting to affirm the inherent dignity and worth of all people, clearly much more needs to be done, right? So the need for much greater investment in testing. We're still unable to test at nearly the levels that are needed. Even more needing to build up the capacities for contact tracing. This has been done again in some of the countries that have been successful. It's been a key part of the strategy. Hasn't been done as much here, and especially wasn't done at the early stage when it would have been most important, but still can be, right? And so you have had people in Congress call for the creation of some of the presidential contenders. So Joe Biden, for example, has called for the creation of kind of a health corps that would put many people to work doing contact tracing. So major investments in things like this are certainly important. The need to really ramp up much more than has happened production of masks and other personal protective equipment, especially medical level masks that are more effective than the cloth masks. The reason people are being told to wear cloth masks primarily is just because the other masks are still, in shortages. They don't need to be. We certainly have the industrial capacity to produce an abundance of masks and other personal protective equipment. That needs to be done. There needs to be a willingness to pause or reverse the reopening when necessary. So it seems like a lot of it has just gotten on to autopilot, right? With people thinking that things were going to get better as we moved into the summer, saying this is going to happen a certain date, et cetera, we can reopen, and then not revisiting those plans when the virus began to surge. Some states have begun to revisit those things. Many others clearly need to do so. There obviously needs to be an emphasis on using masks, or for those who can't use, in some cases, masks, can use face shields, and to really put that forth as acts of love and solidarity, to really frame it in that light, that wearing these things is showing our concern for others, that particularly as if we're talking in a context of Catholic social teaching, something that all Catholics should want to do, to act in solidarity, to act in love, to act out of compassion, to adhere to social distancing guidelines, and even more to continue to minimize in-person social contact as much as possible. One of the things that scientists are more and more suspecting, and more studies are showing, is that transmission isn't just by droplets, which is what the 6-foot kind of radius was meant to deal with, but through what's called aerosols, so smaller particles that can be circulating in the air even after a person moves on from a particular space. And so staying out of crowded environments as much as possible, minimizing in-person social contact as much as possible, continues to be a very important part of how to responsibly respond when is able to, in circumstances where they can do that. The need for guaranteed paid sick leave. So some of the legislation that was passed did provide some additional people with guaranteed sick leave, but a lot were left out of that. And so the idea that everyone needs to be guaranteed that they can take time off of work when they're sick, obviously an enormously important factor for trying to prevent the spread of the virus. Another thing that hasn't been done much in the United States, has been done elsewhere, is to provide places where people who wish to can voluntarily quarantine apart from their own household. So one of the main ways that the virus spreads is within households. Someone gets it, and everyone else in the household ends up getting it. Some countries have been providing, hotels or using dormitories or things like that to give people a safe place where they can go. Food can be brought to them, etc., but they can avoid that in-person contact where they might spread it to their own household. We've seen already calls to reduce mass incarceration, release those in immigration detention facilities. These are people who can't socially distance. They need to be provided with safety to the extent that is possible. A need to enforce worker safety protections. There's been a lot of reports of workers filing reports about unsafe and even life-threatening conditions, and those being ignored by their employers, by the federal authorities in the United States. So needing to ramp up those protections, enforcing environmental regulations. Again, unfortunately, the opposite is being done. So the Trump administration has suspended a lot of environmental regulations in the context of the virus, including air pollution, even though air pollution is highly connected with people being more likely to have serious consequences from the virus. Those need to be enhanced and enforced. And ultimately, everyone needs to be provided with access to healthcare. There's obviously a more kind of medium term reform, but in the short term, things like expanding Medicaid can certainly be done as we move towards a universal healthcare system. Broader measures moving beyond the more direct health-related ones. The need to extend these enhanced unemployment benefits is going to be crucial to happen before the end of this month, when a lot of those benefits would otherwise be greatly cut. Clearly, the crisis continues. Clearly, businesses are likely to be cutting back again on employment. There's going to be a need for the unemployed to have their needs met. Providing other forms of assistance to those in need, to those who don't qualify for unemployment. This would include undocumented immigrants, right? If we're going to affirm the basic human dignity of all, that certainly includes undocumented immigrants. And besides being the morally right thing to do, it's certainly also what's right from the perspective of society. If any group in society goes unprotected, that's going to endanger the entire society with the further spread of the virus. So making sure healthcare is provided, making sure that people are able to meet their basic needs is certainly crucial for all. This includes food assistance like the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP. Unfortunately, again, efforts are being made to actually cut people off of the rolls right now, when many would argue that what's needed is actually expansion. Providing rental assistance or extending the freeze on eviction, certainly another important thing needing to be done to prevent massive homelessness that's otherwise likely within the coming month, as a lot of these current protections expire. And then moving even more broadly, and really getting at some of these underlying issues of economic inequality, economic injustice, the call for massive governmental investment in job creation. It's going to be a long process to get unemployment back down to a low level. Much of that's going to involve a role on the part of the government. So things like a health court to do contact tracing, things like infrastructure projects, things like environmental projects that could be done, or all ways that could be put constructively to work. Certainly, as we're talking about these deeper needed changes, addressing systemic racism in its various forms. We've been focusing especially on racism in terms of policing and the criminal justice system. Obviously, crucial to continue that focus, but also to see that this isn't isolated, right? That systemic racism is embedded in every dimension of our society, including certainly very deeply in the economic realm, and needing to address that, and addressing issues of economic inequality in a much broader way, and promoting the kind of economic democracy the Catholic social teaching calls for. So that will include things like raising the minimum wage, supporting workers' rights to unionize, providing tax benefits, things like that to worker-owned businesses, worker-owned cooperatives. So a lot of things that can be done to address some of these more deeper and systemic problems as well. So then the question arises, well, how will this be paid for? Catholic social teaching makes several suggestions that highlights the need for more progressive forms of taxation, so taxing the wealthy at higher rates, emphasizes the possibility of reducing subsidies, tax breaks for corporations, and also talks about the importance of reducing military spending, which, it should be pointed out, in the US context currently accounts for over half of all federal discretionary spending, recognizing that the coronavirus represents, and that economic inequality represents, some of the most deep and grave threats to the true well-being of our nation. The need to transfer some of those funds. So there's a few good books there listed if anyone's interested in exploring issues of economic democracy in more detail. So Mary Wright, Chuck Collins, The Moral Measure of the Economy, it very explicitly develops their economic vision through the lens of Catholic social teaching. The others don't explicitly talk about Catholic social teaching, but overlap a lot in vision. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winning economist, the book People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent, I would certainly recommend. James Gustav Speth has an excellent book called America, the Possible Manifesto for a New Economy. This vision of economic democracy that we've been talking about, some people will use language like Stiglitz does there, of progressive capitalism. Others will use a language of democratic socialism. Often their visions are actually very similar in what they're talking about, choice of language that gets used. It is interesting to see what Pope Benedict had to say about democratic socialism. People are often sort of surprised by this quote, but Pope Benedict said, in many respects, democratic socialism was and is close to Catholic social doctrine. In any case, it contributed toward the formation of a social consciousness. So he's talking about the positive role that democratic socialism has played in Europe. So some of the Western European countries, Scandinavian countries. So for Benedict, certainly not something to be feared in the way that some people respond to that language in the United States. But Others may choose to use different language. The language of economic democracy is another way of sort of pointing to a lot of these same ideas, or progressive capitalism, perhaps, that Stiglitz uses. So this is looking at the need for very deep and fundamental changes. And then the question arises, well, how can that be brought about? And that's here, I think, where Pope Francis really points us to the role of social movements in terms of bringing about these deeper structural transformations. And I would argue that many building blocks for a multi-issue, multi-racial, multi-generational grassroots social movement really is in place. We've seen that certainly with the Black Lives Matter movement. And many of you, I assume, are familiar with the Poor People's Campaign, which I would consider one of the most inspiring movements going on right now. The Poor People's Campaign addressing systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, militarism in the war economy, and what they termed the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism, sort of a five-pronged focus. The campaign's been doing kind of grassroots organizing, just held an online event that involved over 2 million people. Some of you may be familiar with Reverend William Barber, who's been a very charismatic leader of that campaign, along with Reverend Liz Theo Harris. And if you're not familiar, I certainly encourage you to check out a lot of videos, things like that on YouTube in connection with that campaign. But we've also seen the youth-led climate movement, the Fight for 15 movement in terms of raising the minimum wage, immigrants' rights movements. There's a lot of people active at the grassroots, and I think one of the best things we can all do is find ways to plug into these movements, help them build. And I think these movements in many ways coalescing to seeing the need for some deeper systemic changes in our society. And so lastly, just wanted to end with a few quotes from Pope Francis, again, pointing to that the coronavirus is revealing, this need. I mean, it was already there, but revealing even more deeply the need for fundamental structural transformation. Right? And so these quotes from Francis, I think, highlight that so well. He says, "Do we realize that something is wrong in a world where there are so many farm workers without land, so many families without a home, so many laborers without rights, so many persons whose dignity is not respected? Do we realize that something is wrong where so many senseless wars are being fought, and acts of fratricidal violence are taking place on our very doorstep? Do we realize something is wrong when the soil, water, air, and living creatures of our world are under constant threat? These are not isolated issues. I wonder whether we can see that those destructive realities are part of a system which has become global. Do we realize that that system has imposed the mentality of profit at any price with no concern for social exclusion or the destruction of nature? If such is the case, I would insist, let us not be afraid to say it. We want change, real change, structural change. This system is by now intolerable." So Francis really they're calling for basically nonviolent revolution, some very deep structural changes in our society, and really pointing to grassroots organizing as the path to that. So these are the last two quotes of this presentation. They again come from Pope Francis. "You, the lowly, the exploited, the poor." And I should say these quotes are him speaking directly to worldwide gatherings of grassroots movements. It's some of the most powerful documents in the tradition of Catholic social teaching. I'd certainly encourage you to check them out. You can just Google Pope Francis, popular social movements, and you'll find them. But there's some very, very powerful talks that he gave. "You, the lowly, the exploited, the poor, and underprivileged can do and are doing a lot. I would even say that the future of humanity is in large measure in your own hands. The future of humanity does not lie solely in the hands of great leaders, the great powers, and the elites. It is fundamentally in the hands of peoples and in their ability to organize. You, the popular movements, are sowers of change, promoters of a process involving millions of actions, great and small, creatively intertwined like words in a poem. That is why I wanted to call you social poets. I congratulate you, I accompany you, and I ask you to continue to blaze trails and to keep fighting." And I think as we respond to the coronavirus crisis, finding those ways to connect with the social movements that are raising these deeper structural questions are going to be one of the most important things that any of us can can do, along with our social distancing and wearing masks and things like that. But the question of how to continue to build these movements even in that kind of a context, but recognizing it's that kind of a deep movement that we have just fundamental problems in our society in terms of social justice, in terms of ecology. And band-aid solutions aren't going to be enough. We really need to make fundamental changes and to do it quickly. And so my invitation to all of you with Pope Francis is to say, let's find ways that we can do this and make it happen together so we can create a better world for those already here and for those yet to come. So thank you very much for listening to this. If you made it all the way through to the end, I look forward to engaging in some dialogue and conversation. And so you'll see on the Bellarmine website that there is an event next Monday evening where we'll be able to have a conversation around these issues. So certainly very warmly invite you to join us for that. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Snagaki, for helping us explore a faith-guided path forward in this time of COVID-19. You've given us much to reflect on and to practice. For those who are interested in going deeper, we're hosting a follow-up virtual discussion and meatless meetup with Dr. Snagaki next Monday, July 13th at 6:30 p.m. You can find the RSVP link on the same website you visited to find the live stream tonight. We hope you will join us. A reminder, too, that you can sign up for more ISSJ courses this fall. Thank you again, Dr. Snagaki, for being with us tonight, and thank you all for joining us. A recording of tonight's talk will be available on our YouTube page. We hope to see you all again soon. Thank you for joining us, and stay safe.